Okay, here we are, our first for real class. So here's what we're going to do today. And I've got PowerPoints, and the PowerPoints are actually on Moodle if you wanted to bring them up. I've got slides I'm going to show and kind of work through and talk about as we go. We're going to talk about childhood today and several different aspects of childhood. And we're also going to focus a lot on parenting during childhood, because that is, clinically speaking, what a lot of folks either come to you about, or that's what they should be coming to you about a lot of times, or that's the things that they want to know. And so we're gonna spend some time talking about that. And we probably will talk about the parenting aspect in adolescence as well, but not in the same way as we do with this particular developmental stage. So I think I said this last week. I'm going to skip all the way over, how babies are made and how they're born, because everyone should know that. But we're going to jump right into basically the kind of toddler age all the way through elementary is kind of what our focus will be today. That's my goal. So let me pull up. Oh shoot, I thought I had it. Sorry, I for some reason got rid of my PowerPoint. I'm not sure why I did that. Let me pull it back up. Okay, close that. Okie dokie. Let me make this bigger. Let me move you guys around a little bit. Everything I'm going to talk about today is also in the book. This is, I want to do a little comparison of theories here real quick. Vygotsky and Piaget, they're a little bit different. They have some similarities, but they're a little bit different. The reason why I like starting with these guys is Piaget is pretty well known. Erikson and Piaget are pretty well known, especially in the development world, education world. They kind of come out of Freud, and then there's some changes as they get older. They make some changes. Vygotsky's a little different because he came along and was like, hey, we need to start talking about like their social, like how they're influenced socially or environmentally. He's the one that kind of brought that out. And so if we look at the socio-cultural context of development, Piaget didn't talk about that very much. He was way more in terms of like looked at the cognitive construction, like how we're formed cognitively and the stages that go along with that. Vygotsky said, well, what about the social construction piece? And so he's one of the first ones to start bringing that up. And that probably comes from the old, nature versus nurture argument that's been going on for a long, long time. Is someone the way that they are or develop the way that they do because of nature or genetics, or is it nurture? Is it environmental? And it's probably both. It's probably both things. It's probably a little bit of both. Now, around the time of Piaget, that wasn't necessarily the thought. There was a lot more nature involved. A lot more, your cognitions happen because of this and this and this, because of your brain, not necessarily because of the things happening on the outside of your world. So that has changed over the past 100 or so years. Piaget looks at stages. He is very much about stages. Vygotsky's not really about stages per se. He looks at things a little bit differently, but this proximal development, like things that are happening to you at a certain time, probably have a big influence, and that's contextual. Whereas Piaget gets the schema. In other words, we assimilate to something, and then we disequilibrate, and then we assimilate to the next thing, and then we disequilibrate, which means we get off balance, and we kind of learn how to equilibrate again, and then we make another transition and we mature that way. So they have some different ways to look at things. And so I like looking at this. I like looking at the differences between them, because these guys actually have a lot to say with how we think now. Clinically speaking, one of the reasons why we need to know theories is because when we look and study the theories, we can see how our actual clinical world has also developed, because we have a very different view of development now than we did during the days of Piaget, right? We know things now that we didn't know. One of the reasons why we know things is because we've started to be able to do things like functional MRIs, where we can look at brain scans of people and see how they respond to different stimulus and see different pieces of the brain that react in different ways. The other thing to keep in mind is these are just theories. In other words, we have a theory about how people develop. We have to have a way to organize how and why and when people develop the way they do. And a theory gives us that, right? So that, again, a lot of this is in the book, especially the first part of the book. When we start thinking about childhood, I'm going to, hang on a second. I'm going to look at one thing. Yeah, I got this in here twice. That's what I thought. I'm going to start here and then I'm going to back up. Early childhood is a time when kids start thinking about a self, like the self, like realizing that they're here, and they can start to kind of feel like they can do something, or they can do something, like something's not being done for them anymore. They can crawl and get something, or they can walk. Now that they can walk, they can go over and pick something up off the table or something that's at their height. They start to see the outside world a little bit differently. And then they also start to feel and experience something that's actually really important to our development, and that's guilt. One of the first emotions that we start feeling is guilt, which is kind of important, because guilt is one of the first things that tells us that we're a self, because it tells us that there's other people out around us, right? So if we don't have guilt, if we don't feel guilt early, that kind of throws us off as we develop later. Now, that sounds weird, because we're kind of also taught that you shouldn't feel guilty, or don't feel guilty, or guilt is bad. There's really two kinds of guilt. There is motivating guilt, which is something, okay, I've done something wrong. I did this wrong. I need to make up for that. I need to repair this. That's a good kind of guilt. That motivates us to repair something. And then there's bad guilt, where it's like, hey, I didn't really do that. I didn't do anything wrong, but I feel like I did. I feel guilty because of that. And that leads to shame. And those aren't necessarily good. Those are along the lines of positive guilt or negative guilt, right? So we have kind of a couple of different kinds of guilt. The problem is, when we're little, we can't distinguish between the two. You should be able to do that now as adults, but as children, they're not able to distinguish those two things. When we first have guilt, we can first kind of have the self. And having a self-understanding is basically there's an awareness that your world is expanding, and there's a lot more involved in your world, but you're still the center of it. And that's developmentally appropriate. Okay. The reason why this is important is having this view of self. We got to have a little bit of a view of self in this developmental stage, because when we move to the adolescent stage of development, that's when self-concept comes into play and your identity starts to get formed. You don't form identity in childhood. Identity begins to be formed in adolescence. It doesn't mean that parts of identity aren't formed in childhood. There's for sure some things that can influence the formation of identity, but identity is the big one that starts forming in adolescence. We'll talk about that next time. But before that comes this kind of view of self. It's very important. And this is also during childhood, obviously from the toddlerhood on is when you start getting more active, you start doing more physical activities, you start exploring things more. And some of that's based on your environment, some of that's based on your genetics, some of that's based on the stimulus that you have, some of that's based on the reward system that's put in place. There's lots of things that go into that, but basically those are the things that are happening. The other part of the self is starting to understand others, and that includes other adults, but also other children. Other children aren't necessarily egocentric like Piaget would say. He would look at it as more like self-centered, and I don't think it's like that. Kids don't have the ability to know that they're ego-driven. That's not what they don't think that. They don't have that ability in their brain to think that. They haven't learned that yet. That's kind of important, actually, because if we jump to parenting real quick, and we're going to talk about this more in depth in a second, but if we parent children like they're adults, that's not really helpful. And if we parent children like they're teenagers, that's not helpful either. Teenagers for sure come into the more self-centered piece, the egocentric piece, for a reason. There's a reason why that happens. But children, not so much. So we have to be kind of cognizant of that. Sometimes they do things not because they're selfish or trying to be manipulative. They're doing it because that's what they know to do. And that kind of matters. We're going to talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. All right, this is something, we'll jump to that in a second. I do want to talk about executive function, and I want to talk about it because as we start thinking about childhood, during childhood especially, as we're developing, our brains start developing, and the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, but is on the way to being developed. And that prefrontal cortex is where we have all this executive functioning. So all the executive functioning skills that we need for the rest of our life are housed in the prefrontal. So that's everything like like starting something, finishing something, setting goals, being organized, filtering like what we should or shouldn't do, like the moral centers partly there, making decisions, paying attention. That's all in that prefrontal. It takes decades for the executive functioning pieces of our brain to fully come online. So in other words, it's not there automatically. We're not just born with it. We have to be taught that. We have to be modeled. We have to be disciplined in that way. In a lot of ways, at the beginning of life and probably all the way into late adolescence, parents play the role of a child's prefrontal cortex. That's why we get frustrated as parents when we have to tell our kids the same thing multiple times. Multiple as in like 50 or 100 or 1,000. That's one of the reasons. Not the only reason, just one of them. Okay? So that executive functioning is not there during childhood. It doesn't mean that we can't teach it. It's just not there. We have to teach it. That's kind of a big deal because there's a big difference between something being there that we don't have to teach versus something that we need to teach. And if we think about it, basically you're teaching kids everything. How to crawl, how to walk, how to go to the restroom, how to pick something up, how to eat. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we're teaching. We don't teach how to chew, right? That's an involuntary motion. We don't teach them how to breathe, but pretty much all the skill-based things we start teaching them, right? So this happens early. This starts happening early in childhood. When we start thinking about sustained attention, or the ability to focus and extend engagement as they grow in childhood, that should grow as well. They should be able to hold a little bit more focus for an extended period of time. If they don't, they have a lot of times difficulty in completing tasks. It might affect their reading or comprehension a little bit. which if that affects their reading, that's going to affect a lot of other things in their life. It might inhibit them from relationship building, and it could inhibit them from empathy a little bit. And so again, if a child struggles because their prefrontal is not as advanced as maybe their peers would be in terms of attention, right? Some kids you could look at and they're able to sit for a longer period of time and do something a little bit longer than other kids. Another kid might get up and wander around quicker. That might happen. I mean, if we're being honest, that happens to some adults too. That doesn't mean that they're, doomed to not completing tasks ever in their life, or they're never going to comprehend. That just means that we need to refocus and teach them in a different way. That's all. That's all that means. And that probably means we're going to have to put a little more effort into that. Because not everyone's going to automatically just be able to pay attention like they should, or like we think they should, right? And if we're being honest, we live in a world that's a lot more, that it divides our attention a lot more than it did even 20 years ago. We just live in a lot more different world now. Okay. 100 years ago, we're talking about something way different. With the devices that we have now and the world that we live in now, it just grabs attention a lot quicker, and it makes us jump from thing to thing a lot easier. And that has an effect on it. Okay. Okay. So anytime, I didn't say this at the beginning, if you guys have questions about anything I'm talking about ever, just jump in and just, hey, I've got a question. It doesn't bother me. Okay. Some of this stuff's pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of veering right or left. It's fairly straightforward. The self, like I said, is something that we have to have it first, and we develop it first before we get to the identity. And that's just a big building block to childhood. Okay. Now, sometimes we have questions about like childhood memories and things like that. One of the things that I think is kind of like interesting is when we start talking about earliest memories in childhood. And so like one of the things that I remember from my childhood that I have no idea how old I was, like my parents don't believe that I remember this, and I don't remember this full memory. I just remember being in an apartment sitting on the ground and people's legs in front of me. Like I remember that. And we never lived in an apartment when I was a child, except for when I was born, which it couldn't have been then. And when I was like 2-ish or almost 3, we lived in an apartment for like 6 months before we moved to a house. And I remember the house as I got older. I'm just kind of curious, like if we think about childhood, can any of you tell me like some of your earliest memories of childhood? And there's no right or wrong answer. Everyone's different. I'm just kind of curious.
I remember being watching the moon landing, and I was probably maybe 3 years old. I was in a home with my aunts and uncle, and I just remember watching that on TV and not really comprehending it at the time. But I don't remember that day. I just remember that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a big moment.
Anything that I've remembered from childhood has been more picturesque rather than like moving scenes, versus as getting older, remembering things a lot more detailed has been pretty evident.
Yeah. That's good.
I remember being in a restaurant and seeing this larger man who was a sheriff and being terrified.
Yeah.
And I later learned that I was 2 and we were in the process of moving from Memphis to San Angelo, Texas. And we had stopped in a Burger King. So I got to fill in the blanks later to put the memory together.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay, good.
I have one. I think I was like 3 years old. We were visiting family in Rhode Island. I think everybody was ice skating, but what I remember is falling through the ice and then being pulled up by my big jacket. And I kind of just remembered it, but thought, oh, it was a dream. And I told my mom about it, and she was like, oh no, when you were 3, you fell through the ice and we had to take you home. And it was this whole thing. And I was like, oh, it's interesting that you remember those things, even though I don't have a whole memory associated. I just remember being really cold and the feeling of falling through ice.
Oh my gosh. That's a traumatic memory, but you don't know it at the time.
Yeah, I've got a great therapist.
Yeah. Well, it's more traumatic for your family probably watching you fall through the ice. Like one time when I was probably 6 or 7, I was swimming with my grandmother and my brother, and me and my grandmother were like, where's my brother? We looked around and I looked behind me and he was under the water, like trying to get up out of the water. And I jerked him up out of the water. Like you remember, like there's certain memories that you remember like that, like things like that, right? There's markers, but then other people that you talk to might not remember some of those things, like might not remember some of those markers like in childhood. And so, I think it's interesting talking about, because our memory in childhood sometimes is also colored by experience or environments that we're in as well. And so certain environments tend to have lead to certain types of memories, for example. So, plus I just like talking about it because I think it's interesting. One of the things about like we've talked about with the self is as we get into this kind of middle and late childhood, now we're talking about really more like 6, 7, 8, all the way into elementary years. This idea of like understanding, like self-understanding, like being able to describe yourself as like smart or funny or patient or things like that, they can start doing things like that. They can recognize like social aspects, like things that they like. And some of that's probably because of personality development. Like some kids can start to maybe they wouldn't be able to describe it specifically, but feel that maybe they're more introverted or more extroverted or kind of a mixture of those things. And they would be able to do that. And sometimes they do it based on what other people are doing or not doing. So they start to really kind of compare themselves socially to other people. And so that's a lot of the environment. That's where a lot of the environment context comes into play. And so when kids are, sometimes if there's a group of kids playing, there might be another group that kind of gravitates toward them, right? Because there's a social aspect of it, especially if they're doing something fun. I mean, that's kind of why you get that. At the same time, there could be kids that still are a little bit standoffish. For example, my 5-year-old nephew he just got done with pre-K, and they had the whole like pre-K graduation kind of thing, and they had all of the kids that were from the 4-year-old class that were about to be in kindergarten. They had them up on a stage and they were singing this song about going to kindergarten. And I think there was like 10 or 11 of them. I can't remember, boys and girls, 10 or 11 of them. And they were all singing. They had actions and everything, except for one little boy. He was off to the side. He just stood there. He didn't do anything. He didn't move. He didn't sing. He didn't do anything. And he looked like he was mad basically the whole time. And he wasn't going to do it. And you could tell that probably he wasn't ever going to do it, right? Well, there could be lots of reasons why. One of the things could be he just don't want to be in front of people. Maybe he's embarrassed, or maybe he's introverted, or maybe he just had a bad day. There's multiple reasons why things like that happen. And so when we start thinking about kids, as they get older, and especially like that age 5 and up, they will start having more of a social component to their life, where we start to have social development skills start to come in play. And those things are actually really important for them as they move forward. They start out mostly, girls and boys do it similarly when they start out. But what we know in terms of maturity, girls do tend to mature a little bit quicker than boys in a lot of areas, but eventually boys do catch up to them in a lot of those areas. And so you might see, and there's a lot of reasons probably why that is. At the same time, it doesn't mean that all boys are immature compared to girls. Some boys mature just as quick. So sometimes it depends on environment. And then that is probably a little bit more genetic more than anything, if we kind of look at it. So we kind of keep this nature versus nurture discussion going pretty much our whole life. But the way the discussion has gone the last 20, 50 years has leaned more towards the nurture piece and a lot more towards the social piece than the scientific piece, except for when something's wrong with us, then we say, well, that's my DNA. That's just my genetics. That's just how I was born. That's part of it, but that's not all of it. So we'll talk about that with adulthood. Perspective taking is very important. Okay, let's talk about this for a second. So perspective taking, the ability to assume other people's perspectives, like to understand their thoughts and feelings, like being able to put yourself in their shoes. There's that ability to do that, and it's really a skill. So it's not something that we necessarily do automatically. It's something that we learn how to do, and we can learn how to do it better and better. If we were to fast forward between this childhood time period to adulthood, adults are able to do perspective taking close to 48% of the time without effort. Teenagers I think it's around 16%. So it kind of doubles. So it means there's growth, right? That means it's something that gets better. We're going to watch a video about it next time, but that means it's something that can develop. It means it's something that gets better. You can actually teach it. You can teach kids how to do it. You don't have to wait until they're teenagers for them to do that. Just knowing that there's still pieces of their brain that as those pieces of the brain come online, empathy and perspective taking becomes easier, especially in teenage years. By the time you're in the teenage years, they can really start taking other people's perspective. They can do it in childhood for sure. You just have to be really intentional about it. But that also doesn't mean that they don't sometimes revert back and do whatever they want, because they do that too, right? That can happen to anybody. Okay. I'm going to look at it. There's a couple of things I want to look at specifically. Yeah, let me do, sorry about that. There's a couple of things I want to look at specifically. This idea of self-esteem and self-concept, we're going to talk about more as we get into adolescence, especially. Self-esteem is that kind of global evaluation, like something comes in front of them, they say, I can probably figure that out, I can probably do that, which is obviously connected to their self-concept and a little bit of their confidence. Because concept is more like specific to actual activities or actual things that they're doing. And if we want to work on helping our kids, we should try to help them work on things that are realistic. In other words, not everybody's awesome. And not everybody does things great. We try our best, we do the best that we can, and sometimes we make mistakes. And that's okay. It's okay to make mistakes because that's how we learn and grow. And actually, we help our self-esteem when we make mistakes and we learn from them and we grow from them. That's how our esteem will grow. And that's how our confidence will grow. I'm going to talk about that in a second too. That's kind of like in the family discussion here in a second. But when we have higher self-esteem doesn't mean we'll necessarily perform better in school either. Okay, there's some other skills involved in school performance, but we can have a little bit greater initiative the higher our self-esteem. In other words, we might try more things if we have higher esteem because we think we can figure it out and do it if we have higher esteem. And esteem can go up and down. It's not like set in stone. Same with concept. It can go up and down. Okay, let me camp out here for a second. I think this is where I was trying to get. Yep. Okay. This idea of self-regulation is one that's kind of been talked about now in childhood and adolescence for quite a while, especially in schools. Social emotional learning is really important in schools and came about in the 90s, and I think it's very important, a very important aspect of learning. And it's actually helps with a lot of scores. I think the more you can self-regulate. One of the things about self-regulation that we need to think about is the ability to self-regulate means I am able to manage, not control, manage behavior, manage emotion, manage thoughts, not control necessarily, but I'm able to manage. That's very important. So for example, if a child, let's say they're 10, feels a strong emotion, right? And then they pick something up and throw it. We teach them how to manage their behavior in that instance. And by doing that, we can also talk to them about how that emotion doesn't have to be in charge of whatever they just did. We can kind of work with them on that. The irony of this is that if we don't learn that, guess what happens in adulthood? It's the same thing. They just use a different rock, right? Okay. This doesn't mean that someone's like got a disorder and they're all jacked up and messed up for life. Doesn't mean that. But when we learn self-regulation, which for some kids it'll be harder than for other kids because of their, that's an executive functioning, managing those things. So this is where we come in clinically as clinicians. We can think about behaviors and emotions and cognitions. That's how our brains are wired. And they all three work together, right? So we can work on each one of those. And if we work on one, we work on the other two. Or if we work on two of them, we work on the other one. Because they're all connected with each other. Make sense? Mm-hmm. That's why you have some people that are along the theory of behavioral management. Like they'll go the behavior piece, try to help manage just the behavior. If you manage and train the behavior, the other pieces fall in line. That's why some people go that direction. Some people might go full, emotion management and try to help with that, thinking that the other will fall in line. And maybe there's a mixture of both in there. The one caveat to behavioral management, it's not behavioral modification, because behavioral modification in the long run doesn't work super well. You can do it, you can teach it, but it doesn't always set individuals up for success later in life. It's not bad. I like managing things versus like modifying things or trying to control things or, coming down on something. And there's some nuances there, I realize. But self-regulation is so vitally important in human development. So I'll ask a question that probably is fairly simple. Like, where would a child 5, 10, 12 years old first learn self-regulation? How would they learn about it?
Well, you mentioned that the the parents were the executive function and the prefrontal cortex. So I would think that they would learn it from their caregiver or their parents.
Yeah. Yeah. First thing that kids learn is what they see and what they experience around them.
That's what I was going to say. Excuse me, I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You're good, Curtis. Go ahead.
The environment to me is real important. How their surroundings, what they experience.
That's right.
That triggers a lot of it.
Absolutely. And for good or bad, right? No, we're not talking about, I'm not saying like good or bad, right or wrong. We're just saying this is just what happens. Right? So we first learn it in our environment. So if you have environment that's struggling with self-regulation, what does that mean for the child? Right? They might struggle with self-regulation. Right? It doesn't mean that some kids might be like, hey, wait a minute, I don't want to do that, or I don't want to say that. That can happen too, for sure. Absolutely can. It's just, that's one of the things that we do tend to learn socially. And that tends to have a large influence on us. The environment around us has a large influence on us. It's not the only influence, but it's a large one. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
If you mentioned behavior modification, and you mentioned that managing the behavior is better, can you kind of elaborate?
Yeah. So let me talk about that for a second. All right. So if we let me quit sharing for a second. I feel like I'm like looking over here and I want to see you guys in front of me. It's easier for me to look at people straight on. If we think about, I'm not saying that we should never like try to help with behavior or just let behavior go do whatever. That's not what I'm talking about. We need boundaries. We need structure. What we know for a fact about children, and this is true for people, but for children, is the more structure that they have and the more they know what the structure is, the safer that they feel. And they don't have to guess. You don't want kids guessing about structure. You don't want kids guessing about what may or may not happen. You want kids to kind of know what the structure is and to know what the boundaries are. You don't want them guessing, because when we're guessing and we're not sure, and the longer that goes on, the more we're unsure, the more happens to us attachment wise. And when we have problems with our attachment to people, then we have a lot of problems individually too. So behavioral modification is basically, as we start off, we're obviously going to, have a structure and have a boundary around, like, kids touching hot things or going out in the middle of the road, or, that's obviously we're going to do things like that to keep them safe, right? Eventually, we want our kids, as they get older, to start thinking about those things on their own and not have to rely on us always modifying and managing everything they do. We want them to start thinking. Doesn't mean they're not going to make mistakes. It just means that we don't want to spend our time when they're 18 doing the things that we should have done when they were 8. Right? Because when they're 18, they're no longer really, if you don't have a relationship with them, especially, it'll make things really tough for you. So if we try to modify behavior as they get older, it doesn't work as well. It can work if we have a really good relationship with them. You can still say no. You're still a caregiver, a parent. You can still say no to something. You can still do that. Absolutely. But they'll probably figure out a way to do it, if they really want to do it. The one thing that I know working with people, now this goes back to just clinically speaking, the one thing I know about people is they're going to do whatever they want to do. If someone wants to do something, they'll go do it.
That's right. Yep.
And the older they get, the more that's true. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
Yes.
So you're saying that behavior modification is like when management is self-learning to manage their
That's
own.
right. That's right. Yeah. When we want we want people to learn how to have self-regulation, not be regulated all the time. It doesn't mean that we don't sometimes need to regulate things. Absolutely. We're still adults, right? Right. We still need to know when to step in. Like my son last weekend was mad because my wife got him up to mow the yard and he slammed the door. So we went and took his controller to his video games and his computer. And we just took it to our room, right? We still need to step in and say, hey, that's not appropriate. This isn't appropriate, right? We still need to step in and do that. But what he did later was he said, hey, I think I was really irritated. I was really mad and I didn't know how to tell you I was mad. Well, I like that. I love that. Then we have a conversation. Didn't mean he got his controller back. He still lost the controller for the day, but that means we had a conversation, right? Learning self-regulation is not something we learn overnight. We learn it over time. I know plenty of adults that I've worked with that aren't very good at self-regulating. They'll say whatever, they'll do whatever, the thought comes in, the emotion comes and they go, right? Self-regulation happens over time. It's something that you have to learn, but it's something that you can teach. When we continually try to modify behavior and control behavior, the older we get, the harder it is. It doesn't mean you can't do it. You absolutely can. We just know that as you get older, it gets harder. And I don't know that it's a long-term strategy, because eventually you do want someone to control their own behavior, right? You know what I'm saying? We want to control our own behavior. We want to control our own thoughts. We want to be able to manage what we're feeling. We want to manage what we're doing. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
As it seems like, so with adults, it's what I hear you saying, and it makes a lot of sense. So they haven't been taught how to handle their anger.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be difficult to modify that. I guess it's like
Yep.
You do things to help them manage that. And as they work on managing that behavior, and then I guess they learn how to self-regulate themselves.
Yeah, and we don't, and I'm not saying that people don't learn, like anger. Let's take anger as an example. That's a good example. I'm not saying people don't learn how to behave when they're angry. Everyone does, right?
Right.
It doesn't mean that you learned as I got angry, it was okay that everyone around me hit stuff and threw things and yelled and screamed. That's not necessarily appropriate, but you still learned it that way, right? We learn things. We're going to learn stuff. We're going to learn about self-regulation. In that case, we learned that self-regulation is not really important. I'm just advocating that self-regulation is actually really important. And research tells us that if you're able to self-regulate, you're actually a lot more successful in your life. Now, don't hear me say that you shut down your emotions and don't feel things. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about the opposite. You can't, if you shut down emotions, like if you say, I don't want to feel things, like I want to shut down my negative emotions, my negative feelings, that means you shut down all of them. It's not, there's not like I can only let some through or let others, like shut others down. So in some ways, like I'm cool with my kids feeling emotion, like they've been feeling emotion all their life, and some of them really heavy emotion. I'm cool with that. As a parent, it makes me uncomfortable. I don't like it, but I'm cool with them feeling it because I'd rather them learn how to deal with that and how to regulate their life when they're feeling something. And I'm cool, and I'd rather them learn that their emotion is a data point, not a directive. Like it's just information. It's not telling them what to do. They don't have to do what their emotion's saying. Does that, hopefully that, I'm going off a little bit offline here, but.
That makes sense. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Could I just add,
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add, it sounded like Dr. Bedard, you did both. When he did this, externally we controlled, this is what happened because you did this.
Mm-hmm.
So like we can punish or reward behavior, and that's us outside of.
Mm-hmm.
Him coming back and you having the conversation about how he felt and what was the cause of his feeling that way, and then dealing with what do I do when I feel that way, and how do I discuss that emotion, and how do I deal with that in a way that's more socially acceptable and
That's
more
right.
healthy.
That's right.
there's the two components of it working
That's right.
together.
That's right.
Sometimes we do one, but not the other.
That's right. Most of the time we do one without the other. All right.
Happens lots in school with
Okay.
behavior.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Okay, so I apologize if I'm oversimplifying this, but just the way my brain works, I kind of have to break things down like this. So the way that I'm hearing this is that behavioral management is more of a proactive approach to our internal responses.
Mhm.
And that behavior modification is more an external approach to reactive responses.
Yeah. And we use both,
Okay.
right? We use both.
Yeah.
We do them both. I'm just saying modification in the long run is not super great strategy. That's all.
Got it.
We still do it, right? We still might do it. But management means that I'm teaching you something. I'm helping you regulate something. Like if we look at it from you can even look at it from like a leadership standpoint. If I'm a good leader, I don't totally micromanage every single thing that's happening. I teach people something. Have an expectation, I have a boundary, and then we learn about that boundary. We learn how to interact inside that boundary, right? We learn how to manage ourselves. That's what we want. It's technically what we call it clinically is agency is what we're talking about. Agency is our ability to either manage ourselves or not manage ourselves. So if we have agency about ourselves, then we are able to manage ourselves. In other words, we are able to manage ourselves and we're able to take self-responsibility, which is also really important. We haven't talked about that yet, but when we take responsibility for ourselves, we have agency that way too, which is also really important because that means we don't blame everybody about everything. We take responsibility for ourselves if we've done something wrong. Right? We don't take responsibility for everything, but this is all part of it. And to me, it starts with self-regulation and the ability to regulate ourselves, which we don't start out doing as children. We don't necessarily regulate ourselves as children. If any of you have been around a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old when they're tired or hungry or feel angry, then you know what I'm talking about. Does that make sense? Like go to a mall and sit in a mall and watch, or go to Chick-fil-A sometimes on a busy Saturday and watch. I mean, there's reasons why children have outbursts more so than other developmental levels, because they don't always have the ability to self-regulate when they're little. We shouldn't treat them like they can. We should teach them how to do it. Does that make sense? Maybe, hopefully.
And that's what you were saying. I'm trying to get this. If you cut off the emotion, then how do you help them with their self-regulate? If
You don't. Yeah, you don't.
Like you were saying, you want to have boundaries.
Mhm.
I think I got it. You want to have boundaries so that helps them with their self-regulation.
Yeah. I'm
Nothing
cool
like
if you're
that.
I'm cool if you're mad or you're upset. I'm cool. Now I'm not cool if you take a chair and throw it at me or hit
Right,
your
right.
sister or whatever, yell at somebody, right? Whatever. I'm not cool with that. So I'm going to validate the emotion, but I don't have to validate now I'm getting into a lot of specifics, but we're talking clinically now. I can validate an emotion, but I don't have to validate the behavior.
Exactly. I got it.
So, and I was having a thought with the whole, like, when we started talking about self-regulation, you gave us the definition of managing your behavior, emotions, and your thoughts. But with behavior modification, it's like you can't necessarily modify your emotions and thoughts as quickly as you can a behavior.
Mm-mm.
And so that could be the problem too, is if we're trying to modify a behavior and that's just, reactive, like someone said, or it's not like getting to a root, but management is like,
Yeah.
it's connecting all three.
If I try to modify your behavior and you're angry, then I'm not acknowledging that you're angry. I'm just telling you, okay, I don't care if you're angry or not, don't do that. Now, having said that, there could be an appropriate setting where anger is like, okay, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't mean that you can just fly off the handle anytime you want. But modification basically is trying to be more controlling over even what you're feeling. And what I would argue is that emotion-wise, specifically emotions, we don't have control over our emotions. Emotions happen. We're not in charge of them. we don't have to let them be in charge of us, but they just happen. Right? Now, thoughts are a little different. We can have a little more kind of control over thoughts. Like if we start having negative thoughts, let's say, we can grab them and go, hey, wait a minute, let's take a break from that. Behavior is what we have the most control over for sure. We don't have to behave a certain way. It's not like mandatory. We can be in charge of that. Now, if someone has certain types of disorders, maybe that's not necessarily as true, for sure. But we're not talking about like major psychological disorders. We're just talking about normal development. The majority of people have normal development, and this is kind of what they go through. Just knowing that children don't come out of the womb self-regulating. They have to learn how to do it. And how do they learn? We teach them. So if we're not doing it, they're not going to do it.
Thank you, teacher. Is there any like a strategy before, even as adult when I was angry, I know I was wrong, but how to finally self-regulate? Is any certain strategy? My things is, even I'm very conscious of I'm angry and say some bad things to my daughters. I think it's not proper, but I like two voice in my mind and just say some bad things, complain. At the same time, I know I'm wrong, but I don't know.
Can't stop yourself. Do you have trouble stopping?
Yeah. At the beginning, I have to, complain and then I stop. Otherwise, I cannot stop.
Yeah.
I know it's wrong, but I cannot control,
Yeah. So one of the things I feel like you're talking about is, and anger's come up a couple times. So let's just talk about anger real quick. If we get angry, everyone gets angry. There's not a human being everybody gets angry. I had an argument. I wasn't arguing. I was running a group one time, and one of the guys in the group argued with the co-leader I was with that said he never got angry. And I was like, what are you talking about? And then he kept getting angry, more angry the whole time. Everyone gets angry. Anger is an emotion. It's typically a secondary emotion. Okay, I'm on a rabbit trail now, just FYI, but this is kind of important. Anger is technically a secondary emotion. The primary emotion of anger is typically like hurt or fear or maybe a deep worry or super deep anxiety, let's say maybe. So when we feel angry, the problem is the secondary or primary, that doesn't come to mind when we're angry. We just get angry. It's just like, bam, we're angry, or something's irritating and we get mad, and maybe it builds over time, or maybe it happens real fast. Depends on our fuse. We don't have control over that necessarily, but we do have control over what we do as a result of feeling that. We have more choice over our behavior as a result of what we're feeling, right? But unfortunately, what we do is try to do the opposite of what we should do. We try to stop the anger and don't really focus on the behavior. I'm saying don't do that. It's too tiring, first of all, and you can't do it. That's a no-win. If you're angry, there's a reason why you're angry. You might not be able to figure it out right then, but there's a reason why, probably somewhere there's something going on. Maybe something triggered it even 2 days ago and it's been building. I don't know. It's okay to feel angry. What you need to focus on is what you're going to do as a result of being angry. For example, last night I was irritated with something. My wife and I were talking, and I knew that the more I got irritated, I was probably going to do something or say something that I shouldn't do or say. So I got up and I walked off. Went and took a shower, chilled out, came back, and we talked. That's what I did then. If it's with one of my kids and they get angry with me, I'm cool with it. But if they say there's a couple of things that they could trigger in me that's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're doing, I'll feel myself getting, tense. Like you can feel it in your body. You can feel physically getting tense. I'll have to take a breath. I'll have to calm. You have to intentionally work on calming. So for some people that means take a walk. Some people that means to count to 10. Some people that means walk away. Some people that means you get in the car and drive. Some people listen to music. You have to do things that help you soothe. So some of what we're trying to figure out with self-regulation is, how do we self-soothe, right? When you're a kid, when you're little, you get soothing from another person, which can be super helpful, right? It doesn't mean that as adults we can't get soothing from other people, but in these cases with our kids or with our spouses or with our partners or with other people, you know, we can help soothe ourselves. We can learn how to calm. And I don't have a lot of time to go into like every kind of thing you could do, but we have more control over our behavior than we do over the actual emotion. But unfortunately, we flip-flop that and try to control the emotion and don't focus on the behavior, if that makes sense. Does that help? Does that make sense at all? Hopefully, maybe.
Yes, it helps a lot. And I get the words, the how to calm down and how to get soothing. So that helped a lot. I just found my way to calm down. Like me, always a good meal. It's helped a lot. So
Yeah, food's good. I love
appreciate
food.
it.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you
Absolutely.
so much.
You're welcome.
So, yeah.
And just FYI, it takes human beings on average 20 minutes to physiologically calm down. So some people look less, some people more, if you're doing things to help you calm down. If you're not doing things to help you calm down, you won't start calming down. So now that's just, I mean, that's just, and it doesn't mean that anger means we yell or throw. Sometimes we get quiet too. Sometimes we stonewall people. We just don't say anything. We just act that, and that's like a controlling behavior too. We can do both things. All right, we successively have gone way off course, but that's okay, as long as it's helpful. Okay, let's let me take a step back for a second. Christina, I see your question here in the chat. Christina, why don't you come on and could you talk about this a little bit more specifically?
Yeah, I just know that some of the things that you covered initially as you were going through like your lecture slides was the kind of executive functioning part, the development of the self, the ability for perspective taking. And so of course, since our kiddos got their diagnoses and my husband recently got his ASD diagnosis, to kind of, we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we teach these things? How do we make more of an emphasis as they're like, what you're talking about is they're in the space where these things are developing still. So like, how can we best support them? So the question was more about resourcing them to go deeper in these things with maybe some application. Because I know that with them having, you know, Asperger's, which is not a DSM category anymore, but that's what they said. If you're research Asperger's, that they're going to be limited in their ability for empathy, in their ability for perspective taking, and in their, and you know, of course, ADHD, there's always going to be a little bit of executive functioning that, you know, they just need more support in. So I guess I was just wondering, as you're talking about these things, generally we're talking about neurotypical development. So like if you had any additional resourcing or just something that you could say to our neurospicy family
Yeah.
of neurodivergent cuties. So
Yeah. My suggestion is to go find someone really good to talk to, someone that has experience in these areas. And that's why we're all taking these classes, because we're trying to learn to be those people. Clinically speaking, this is the kind of thing this is the reason why we're trying to learn, right? So when we're talking about specifically ADHD, there are great people that work specifically just with ADHD. Same with the spectrum from Asperger's. Technically, it's on the spectrum now, but Asperger's they're both. It doesn't mean that people can't function. It just means that they function differently. And the way I look at it is, like you were just saying, neurotypical versus neuroatypical. That just means someone's brain works one way and another person's brain works differently. That's it. Not right or wrong. Our brains work differently. Everybody's brain works differently. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That was the first thing I would say is, if you can help people understand, hey, this is just how your brain works, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not weird or bad or anything, because sometimes we feel like we're abnormal because of that, and that's not true. Our brain just works different. So my suggestion would be to find really good resources to help with that. Now, there's obviously books and articles and things like that, but finding a good therapist, good counselor that works in those areas that's what I would suggest doing. That's the direction I would go.
That's very difficult in today's world. So many of them are so overwhelmed. They're not taking new patients. They're, especially where children and adolescents are concerned,
Mhm.
and trying to find the help you need is just that. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing.
That's why we're all here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's hard. I don't disagree. Yeah. We're mental health providers are pretty stretched right now, for sure. Absolutely. Okay. Let me see. I kind of talked about, I'm going to jump back into a couple of slides here, and then I'm going to shift gears again for a second. And then we're going to have a couple of group discussions too. Well, at least one for sure. We kind of were talking about this, parents as managers, like managing things. You can look at it like when kids are little bitty, like you're kind of like a cop, like don't do that, do that. Like you have to teach them, do it this way, don't do that. Like you don't want them running out in the street or touching things or grabbing things to hurt themselves. As kids get older, you are kind of like a manager. You're kind of managing things. And as they get into like adulthood, it's more like a coach or consultant. So it's kind of a little bit different as they get older. But when kids are in this age, the developmental stage we're talking about now, like especially through elementary, you have a chance to manage the things that they do or don't do. I mean, you can put them in activities, or not let them be in activities. You can monitor things a little easier. And it's also, you're kind of maintaining whatever structure you want put in place, right? So clinically speaking, some things you can do for families, especially if you work with families or if you work with adults even that come to you and they want to talk about parenting. What we know for sure about like things like structure or boundaries and being adaptive and flexible, families that are most successful tend to be flexible and adaptable. It doesn't mean that they have no boundaries or no rules. It just means that they're able to flex and be adaptable as kids grow and as families grow and change. For example, if you have a 12-year-old and they play outside, whatever, and the rule might be, hey, when it's dark, come inside. I'm just making this up. And then they're 17 and you have the same rule, that's not very flexible, right? If you tell your 17-year-old, they might be going out when it's dark. That might just be the first time they go somewhere, right? So that means you got to be a little flexible and adaptable to them and what's going on. Doesn't mean you don't have a rule or structure. Just means you can be flexible and adaptable. And if you're able to do that in a collaborative way with them, it's even better. You can have them start to kind of manage themselves. We kind of talked about that a little bit. It doesn't mean you don't have rules. It doesn't mean you don't have structure. It doesn't mean that you don't enforce boundaries. It means that you're able to have some flex and adaptability in how that happens. It also means that you're able to flex and adapt to different ways of communicating with them. When we communicate with kids, we communicate differently than we communicate when they're teenagers or adults, right? We just communicate with them differently. We haven't talked about attachment theory yet, but I want to talk about attachment theory because we're going to talk about it from now on. Attachment theory, I'm going to give you, mounds of research in a 2-minute definition. So this isn't all of attachment theory, but kind of in a nutshell, it's the safety and security that someone feels with when they're children with their caregiver, whoever their caregiver is. For example, if you are playing chase or tag, you're running, it's kind of fun. You're trying to get to a base. And once you get to a base, then you're safe. They can tag you, but you'll never be it. You'll always be safe. If we fast forward that into adolescence or adulthood, we don't want in our families and with our caregivers, with the people that we care about, we don't want to have to run from them or chase them. We want that relationship to be safe. We want that relationship to be our base, our safe spot. That's what we want inside of us. And if it is, we're pretty securely attached. If we're a little insecurely attached, if we're kind of running or chasing, if we're not sure about that relationship, if we're, like I said a while ago, we don't want kids guessing, when mom gets home or dad gets home or aunt or grandma Joe gets home or whoever, are they going to be mad today? We don't want them guessing that, especially emotionally. We can be a little insecure with that. And that means when we're insecure with our attachment, we don't change unless we change it ourselves. We grow into adults that have that insecurity in terms of attachment. And then all of a sudden we're with another person that could be insecurely attached. And then we tend to react to those things. This isn't like a death sentence kind of thing. We can change our attachment style as we get older if we want. We can change it. This is just kind of how things start. And the reason why they learned about it, the way they started learning about attachment in the first place was in Romania. After the Second World War, you had scores of families that had died but left infants or babies, and they had them in orphanages. And one of the things that was observed about kids, little babies, is they would cry, obviously, when they need something to be fed or changed or something was wrong or they were sick, and they would cry and cry and cry, but they wouldn't always have enough people to get to all the babies. So eventually they would stop crying. And some of those kids would never cry again because they just kind of figured out no one's coming. So they just kind of figured that out. So that's kind of the beginnings of attachment theory. And it kind of took off from there. So the beginnings of it was more of like attachment to a caregiver kind of theory. And now it's morphed and changed into also like how adults attach and how other people attach and things like that. There's a lot to look at there, but we'll kind of talk about attachment and how it becomes a little more sophisticated as kids get older, because it's fairly sophisticated in the family, because what you want is you would like to see your kids begin to not necessarily emotionally, but physically detach and be able to be a little more autonomous outside of you so that they can be independent and kind of do their own thing. You want that. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. And that's all part of attachment. Man, let me take a step back for a second. All right, let me stop there. Here's what I'd like to do. I want to do a quick group discussion, and it's going to be fairly simple. It's going to be a lot of times when I teach this class and especially when we start talking about families, we bring up things from our own families, and maybe we start thinking about how we were raised or not raised, or relationships from back then, and they were either good or bad or whatever. And that happens with pretty much all the students in this class usually. And so one of the things that I would like for us to do is not necessarily get in a group and let's all badmouth our growing up years. That's not what this is for. What about things that you learned as you grew up, right? Like what things have you taken with you into adulthood that you learned in childhood? And that could be anything. So that's really your only question. I'm going to put you in groups. What things did you learn in childhood that you've taken with you in adulthood? Okay. So that's our breakout room assignment. All right. So you should see something pop up on your screen. You just jump in there and have at it. All right. Anybody have any funny stories? Gotta have something funny.
Just in general or related to what we talked about?
Yeah, related to what come on, Michelle. Yeah, related to what you talked about. I'm just curious.
I had a
Where is she going?
way I dry my hair with a towel. That's what I learned from my mom. And so I still do it that way.
The way you
flip
dry
my
your
head.
hair?
Yes, I got a shower and I fling my head up and down over and over again until it's like loose, and then you just
Ah,
yeah, the whole process is learned.
yeah, I like it. Anybody else?
I think there's a general humor in being a parent to kiddos, and your initial response, like even though you grew up and you knew you hated it when your parents did it a certain way, but that first response just comes up in you and you're like, I'm my mother or I'm my father. And then you have to kind of like take the steps and the humility of like, hey, that was my first response. Can I try again? You know, and I think one thing with me and parenting is just like keeping it a little bit humorous, but also like having the humility when necessary. So we make a lot of apologies of like, hey, I just want you to know you didn't come with a manual. We're figuring this out as we go, but I see that I hurt your feelings and I want to make that right. And then, you know, we can hopefully laugh about it later. But yeah, that I think the general humor of like how pre-programmed we are just based on our experiences,
Yeah.
that nature versus nurture, like it is an ongoing conflict of self, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. That's good. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. We even say things like my kids were little, they would say, Dad, I want to go, let's go, whatever, outside. I'll say, oh, I got a bone in my leg. I can't do that. Well, my parents said that to me growing up. My grandparents said that. So now guess what? My kids say it. So they'll probably say it to their kids. So yeah, we even say things like that, right? We just have even little sayings, like there's family sayings that we might have. And so I like reframing conversations about family away as much as possible from, super negative. Obviously, we all have, no parent is perfect, including us. If we're parents, no one's perfect. There's always things that are messed up. And there's always a reason why there's not perfection, because something, if we had a bad childhood experience with our parents, they might have had a bad childhood experience with their parents too. And so we can take some things from what we learned in childhood, and there might be some things we don't want to take with us too. That's true as well. I do want to say one thing about especially kids, and this is true probably of people, but if we can learn this little acronym about kids, and we can teach this to our a lot of the folks that we work with. The acronym is HALT, HALT, HALT. So when a kid is kind of losing their mind and they're kind of blowing up and maybe they're mad, this helps a lot. So it's HALT is hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. So there's a good chance it's one of those four things is going on. And if we're honest, some adults are that way too. That might be a people thing. some ways we can use that as kids get older for themselves to realize, are they hungry? Are they angry? Are they lonely? Are they tired? And we can use it as a training tool for them, so that we can kind of figure out some of the things that are going on and what they can do about it. And so I wanted to pass that on. It's not technically in my notes here. So I want to jump back in to we're gonna talk pretty much. We're gonna talk about emotions a lot, because as counselors and therapists, we kind of live in the emotional arena with our clients in a lot of ways. And so helping people with what the things that they're feeling, and even giving them ways to talk about it, or ways to describe it, or ways to feel it, is very important. And we kind of talked about this idea of like guilt being some of the first emotions that kids feel. Same thing, pride is similar. So pride and guilt happens, it happens early in childhood, like having pride and having guilt. Those emotions are kind of some of the first ones to come. Pride, shame, embarrassment, guilt in childhood are fairly prevalent, and are going to be prevalent, from the moment we start having them on. And so those are examples of like self-conscious kinds of emotions. Now in childhood, we might not be able to say, well, I'm feeling pride, or I'm feeling shame, or they just feel it. Might not know how to name that exactly, but that's pretty common for that to happen. And how they express their emotions is actually heavily influenced by their parents or caregivers' response to the behavior. So I just gave you that HALT kind of anagram there, like how we respond to them expressing emotion. That's heavily influenced on how they'll express it. So kind of goes back to self-regulation as adults. If we're able to self-regulate our emotions as a result of their emotions, which we can have hardcore emotions and hardcore emotional responses based on what they're feeling, goes a long way with helping us help them express what they're feeling. Now, having said that, we don't just help kids or help our clients express emotion. We help them learn like what to do as a result of it. Like expressing it's great, knowing what it is, being self-aware and expressing it's awesome, but what do we do as a result? That's also important too. That part's very important. So, but the influence of parents' responses to behavior really influences the expression of emotion.
I'm sorry, I missed it. You said we helped them. I missed that. That was important. We helped them do what? I'm sorry. I missed that.
So we got it. Oh, sorry guys, my dog's about to go nuts because the mailman's here at my door. Sorry. When we help someone express emotion, like I'm feeling sad or I'm feeling mad, that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. It's also helpful to help them learn what to do with that, or help them start learning that it's okay to feel that and it's not going to be there forever. We don't have to sometimes do anything because we're feeling that. So helping them with the behavior as a result of whatever they're feeling is also important. And especially clinically speaking, that's a lot of what we're doing with people. We're helping people learn behaviors like doing things as a result of what they're feeling. That's a lot of what we're doing.
So it's like I talked to a counselor one time. I asked her a question. I think she said she was a trauma counselor.
Mm-hmm.
And the question I asked, she was like, "Oh no, they'll never forget. We just help them deal with it."
Yeah, we help him cope. Yeah. Trauma is a very specific thing in terms of emotional experience, because our emotions also don't have a lot of like memory. Like they don't have memories. They just have a context that they live in. So if our emotions are not necessarily trapped, but live in a context of trauma, even though we might have moved on physically from a trauma, our emotions might be still back at the trauma. what we do with those folks is try to help their emotions come forward. And so that they're not trapped emotionally back at the trauma. So we don't necessarily forget, but we can also learn, our emotions can learn to be in a new context instead of the old context. I just gave you like the 10-second version of trauma therapy. There, it's a little more intensive than that, but that's kind of the basic idea.
Well, if you want to see how dysregulated parents are in our society, go to a theme park on any given day. And those kids are all hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, but the parents are dragging them around because they're going to get their money's worth out of that theme park day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I've done that. We've all done that. None of us are perfectly regulated. That's for sure. Because we're probably hungry and tired at a theme park too. That's for sure. Especially if they're really expensive. So parenting styles, I'm going to introduce this parenting style concept now, and then we're going to pick it back up our next class. And so these are kind of like general buckets in terms of parenting style. Authoritarian parenting style is fairly restrictive, fairly hard boundaries, hard structure, not super flexible. Well, not really flexible. Authoritative parenting encourages children to be independent. It means there are structure and boundaries. There's just some flexibility there. Neglectful parenting can be kind of like authoritarian parenting a little bit, in that it's like put the structure in place and then you don't really have a relationship at all. Authoritarian parents might actually have a relationship with their kids. Neglectful parents don't have as much of a relationship always. Indulgent parenting is exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of like loose boundaries, loose structure, kind of figure it out, do whatever you want kind of thing. Parenting probably floats inside of all four of these at some level, at some times probably, especially if we're new parents and not really knowing. Most of the research kind of tells us that we tend to gravitate towards one that we grew up with for the most part at the beginning, but we can intentionally move if we want. We know that authoritative parenting conveys the most benefits to the child and the whole family, research wise. So that kind of, hang on a second, the kind of second one there, the authoritative, what's important about that is that it doesn't mean there's like a lack of boundaries or structure or rules or anything. It actually means there are, and that it is in place, but there's also an intentional focus on developing some of the skills that we've been talking about in terms of like self-regulation and building a relationship in a certain way. It doesn't mean that you're like friends with your kids per se at either. It means that you say what you mean and you follow through and you have discipline and you have those boundaries. At the same time, you are also allowing your kids to experience some independence, and you're encouraging some of that in a safe way, in a positive way. There's a couple of things I want to, always run out of time. I'll stop here. In terms of punishment, I'll just be honest. I don't have a lot of interest in like us debating if corporal punishment's okay or not. I'm just going to tell you what the research says. Corporal punishment is linked to lower moral internalization, which means more shame and guilt in kids. It's linked to further future mental health issues. It's better to handle misbehavior with reasoning. Doesn't mean that you don't have rules or discipline. It's basically, corporal punishment really focuses more on fear-based types of punishment versus trust-based, which are two totally different things. And so just from the research that we know, fear-based types of motivations do work. They've been working for centuries. They'll keep working. but that's not a long-term solution, because what it does is it incites more fear as people get older, and it doesn't allow for trust to develop, and it somewhat inhibits our ability to be independent. It doesn't mean that we're messed up or we can't function. People function fine. But when we function out of fear versus out of trust, that's two totally different things. And so that's kind of all I'll talk about there. I realize that, or at least sometimes when I've taught classes, that's been kind of a hot button issue. I'm just talking about it from a research standpoint, just what we know about it. That particular topic, like corporal punishment and kind of what goes along with that, it's a whole, man, there's a plethora of research out there available for people to look at and check out. I tend to focus on if we're going to use fear-based approaches or trust-based approaches. And what we know from research is trust-based approaches work better in the long term than fear-based. It doesn't mean that you can't use either one. You can't sometimes interchange them. People do. But that's just kind of what the research tells us about that. And so when we come out of childhood into adolescence, which is where we're going to next, trust-based types of things are good to have with adolescence, which means a couple of things, and we'll talk about this more next time. With adolescents, your relationship with them, it becomes more important.
Right, yeah.
As they get older, and the type of relationship you have becomes more important. Because if you have a lot of rules but you don't have a relationship, you get a lot of rebellion. Basically, is kind of what happens. And so and sometimes they're going to rebel anyway because they're trying to figure things out on their own, which we'll talk about next time. That's a whole other thing to jump into. Okay, this whole PowerPoint's up online. You guys can check it out. I do want to take a step back here, kind of as we have like 20 minutes or so left. Do you guys have any questions about anything we've talked about today, or anything? What can I answer for you? Or is there anything we can talk about more to help?
I have an assignment question. Can we ask that?
Yeah, absolutely.
This APA Part 1, can you explain that again?
Yeah. So you're just going to find an article, any article, doesn't matter where, and then you're just going to quote a line or quote a thought from it, like quote the author directly, and then you're just going to cite that correctly. And then the second sentence will be a paraphrase of that thought in your own words, and then you'll cite that correctly. There's two different ways to cite those. And then you'll create a reference of that article. Does that make sense? Maybe, hopefully.
So we're gonna cite the same quote two different ways.
That's it. You got it.
Okay.
There's two different ways to cite a direct quote or a paraphrased statement.
Okay.
So I cite the paraphrase statement and I cite the quote.
That's it.
And you may, that's it?
That's it.
No reference, nothing like that?
Yeah, you make a reference for the reference just tells me where you got the article, right? So you do reference, basically you give me the reference of the article.
Do you want a cover page like it's a whole
No,
paper?
just on the page. No, you don't have to do a cover
Okay.
page. Just put your name on it though, on the top, so I know who it is.
Okay.
So no cover page, none of that?
No, you don't need a cover page. And you can do all this on one page, it's fine.
On the lesson coming up there, so like I said, just from that reflection, that's just to answer two questions.
Mhm.
Pick two questions from that and answer those two questions. And I know you want 2 to 3 pages.
Yeah, did we put, let me look, hang on a second. So on the, let me share, I'll share my screen real quick. So on the forum discussion, which is the part that you post to the forum, I've got like two, what lifespan did you choose? What do you remember about this stage, or what do you look forward to? And what did you learn? And you're just going to answer those questions on the forum, right? On the actual thing that you're turning into me, the exercise that you're turning into me, that is where you're turning in the review, connect, reflect sections. You're picking 2 of those sections. You answer all of those questions. So with the forum, you're just
okay.
answering a question. I think every forum's got like 1 or 2 questions, maybe 3 questions that you answer to post on the forum. And then you just make comments on other people's posts.
But on the, I'm trying to get on the review, connect, reflect, like it says review, connect. So I take 2 questions from that review and answer those questions,
No, you do the whole thing.
answer all the questions.
Yeah. In the review, connect, reflect sections. Yep.
What?
So every question in the review, every question in connect, I answered all those questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I thought
So
you said only two, you
But you
said
said
two.
2. Oh, no.
okay, this is a whole section, right here, right? Review, connect, reflect. Can everybody see this? Let me hang on a second. Let me share this right. Sorry, I was sharing the wrong thing. Hang on just 1 second. All right.
Yeah.
This is on Moodle too. I'm just getting it right off Moodle. So every chapter has 2 or 3 or 4 of these little sections in it.
Mm-hmm.
So what you turn into me is you pick 2 of these full sections, answer all of these questions. Review, connect, reflect. Right?
Oh, wow. I didn't know. Okay.
You pick 2 of those. Choose 2 of these
Or
sections.
chapter.
Does that make sense?
So is it, you saying, oh, I don't know what I'm confused here. So this is, so I'm answering all these questions and all the question review and all the questions and connect and reflect your own personal journey of life, or I'm answering that too.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Then I go to another one and, or
And,
what do you-
and go to another one and do the same thing.
oh, okay. And so that's 2 to 3 pages each, or just 2 to 3 pages for both of them?
I would think 2 or 3 pages for both of them. I would think that would be
Okay.
enough.
To have to answer every question,
Mm-hmm.
every question in the review I have to answer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm glad I said something. I didn't know that.
Yep.
Okay.
But it doesn't have to be APA though, right?
No.
Okay.
We just, okay, so no cover sheet, just write it and,
Yep.
okay. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, because I know where you're getting it from, right? Like I know it's coming from the book. So some of these sections have more questions maybe than others. Like this one's pretty short. This one wouldn't take very much time. But they're all different. They all look different. I think this might be the very first one, maybe. I'm not sure.
So we can pick any 2, basically, any 2.
Any 2. Yep.
Okay.
Pick 2 blue boxes.
That's it.
And do it all.
That's it.
But sorry, they have to be a part of childhood, adolescence, or adulthood, isn't it? Though.
Yeah, that's the only 3 stages we got in the whole book.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, it can be any of those. It can be
Yep,
like
'cause I actually-
if you're reading a section, right? Like if you're reading chapter 5 right now, you can pick something out of chapter 5. Doesn't matter where it is.
No.
I know
Well,
I read it and I was doing them for chapter 2 and 3, and then I realized, because I printed out the rubric thing that you've got online, and then I realized. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, what you did is it doesn't matter where these come from. You can choose these from anywhere in the book.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in our format, can I have just have the question written out and then an answer under the question?
Sure.
Okay. Okay.
I
Right.
just want you to, what I need to know is where you get like I need you to just to tell me that you did 2 of them, right? Like, hey, here's number 1 and here's number 2, right? And then what I would do is just have review, answer the questions, connect as a header, answer the question,
Okay.
reflect as a header, and answer the question. That's
Okay.
the best way to do it.
Okay.
And the other thing that I've done as well, as I was reading the chapter, I started doing the study guide, and that
Yeah.
helped me too. So
You should definitely start doing the study guide as you read. Absolutely.
All right.
Sorry, literally means we have to choose 3 chapter to do 2 of the review or connection reflection.
Well, you can choose 2 within the same chapter if you'd like.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, I think most chapters have at least 2. Some of them have 3. Just
Oh,
kinda
sorry. My question is for the whole semester.
Mhm.
So how many chapters we have to choose to do this?
So you're going to do 6 total, but 2 per assignment.
What's that mean? 3.
So for assignment 1, exercise 1, you're going to do 2, right? And for exercise 2, you're going to do 2 more. So that's 4. And then for exercise 3, you'll do 2 more blue boxes. And that's 6. And those can come from anywhere. So some chapters might have 2, some might have 3. So you'll just do 2 for each assignment.
For the chapters, we can free to choose whatever chapter.
That's right. That's correct.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions about this?
Just one quick question. So for the forum posts, we're not needing to include citations. Is that just for the APA paper?
Yeah, that's just for the APA. The forum post is just literally like, hey, I think a lot of them are mainly like reflection kind of things or quick answer. Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Anything else?
I do have a question about one of the things you were talking about whenever we went down the rabbit hole earlier.
Yeah. Okay.
What class would be available to actually go down those rabbit holes?
Which one?
Well, you were talking about like the emotions, like, anger being a secondary emotion.
Yeah.
Primary emotions could be fear or, hunger, loneliness, being tired, whatever.
Yeah.
So, just, are there any classes specifically that might kind of lend themselves to kind of digging deeper into those topics?
I would think most of the classes will talk about aspects of all of those things. I'm going to talk a lot more about emotions in adolescence and adulthood for sure. But most of the classes will talk about aspects of all of those, but there's not like a specific class just on that, I wouldn't say. So there's probably not a class on that. There's classes on like techniques in counseling that will talk about some of that. So that's probably as close as we would get to like a specific class.
Okay.
You're going to have other specific classes on like ethics and professional counseling and techniques and that and assessment and things like that. The reason why I talk about it in this class is we have it's a little more broad, so we can talk about a lot of different things.
Have you, are you familiar with the book called Brainstorm by Daniel Siegel?
Yep, love it. Great book.
Okay. It's on my reading list.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's a great book. He's a great writer, and he has done a great job of talking about the neurology of an adolescent brain. It's great. It's really good. I think it's an orange cover, I feel like. It's really good. It's deep. It's not an easy read. He doesn't hold back, but it's good.
Yes, it's an orange cover. This is it.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's really good. He's got another book called, see if I can stretch over here without jerking my mic out of the thing. He's got a book called Mind. It's really if you want to just fall asleep at night, but also learn something, this is maybe one of the best books I've read about like just human thought. It's really, really well written, but it's pretty deep. It's very good. Yeah, Daniel Siegel's very good. All right. Anything else?
Sorry, I just asked a question in the chat because I was like,
Oh yeah.
I copied and pasted it. I noticed in the forum for part B, that had this question: which lifespan stage did you choose? Does that mean choose for?
Yeah, if you chose if you chose a stage in the part A, includes prenatal, right? Like you might have chosen anything, whatever you chose, like just say what you chose basically.
Like chose when it asked us which one was the best, when it said what's the best age, is that
Oh, what?
it's alluding to?
Oh, that was just talking about like what do you remember about whatever that stage was? Like if it was childhood, what do you remember about it?
Okay,
It's-
so
it's
just
more-
pick a stage.
Yeah, it's more just a reflection on how you're answering whatever stage you're talking about.
Okay.
And I realize this first assignment, some people might not choose a specific stage. I get that, and that's okay.
Oops.
Does that help?
Yep.
Any other questions? All right. Now it's Saturday. Go do something else. Take a nap, go eat lunch, whatever. Don't have to go home, but you can't stay here.
Do homework.
Do homework. Yeah, go read.
Thank
See you guys next time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.